On the night of March 15th, 1989, 17-year-old Tracy Kirkpatrick was working alone at a women's clothing store in Frederick, Maryland. Tracy was a bright and hard-working high school senior, an honor student at Brunswick High with dreams of college and law school. That evening, Tracy was closing up the Alien Ladies Sportswear boutique at a local shopping mall. When the store's usual 9 p.m. closing time passed and the lights remained on, a security guard making his rounds grew concerned. Around 10:30 p.m., he entered the shop to check on things. In a back storage room, he made a horrific discovery. Tracy's lifeless body lay on the floor, the victim of a brutal attack. The guard immediately contacted police, and Tracy's shocked parents arrived soon after, only to be met with the devastating news that their daughter was gone. Investigators at the scene found no clear motive for the slaying. Tracy's wounds indicated she had been attacked with a knife, but there were no defensive injuries on her. This suggested she might have been taken by surprise or attacked by someone she trusted. There was no evidence of any other form of assault, and robbery didn't appear to be a factor since the cash was left in the register. However, Tracy's purse was missing, and the front door had been left unlocked. There were also no signs of forced entry or of a struggle inside the store. Police noted a few drops of blood leading toward the back exit, as well as the loading dock area, indicating the perpetrator may have fled out the rear of the shop into the night. However, a man waiting in the parking lot outside for his girlfriend told officers he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual during the relevant time frame. Based on the evidence, detectives theorized early on that Tracy likely knew her attacker and had let them into the store, or perhaps the person had waited until closing when she was alone. The quiet community of Frederick was stunned. Violent crime was rare in the area, and Tracy's untimely end shocked everyone who knew this friendly, helpful individual on the verge of adulthood. Frederick police launched an intensive investigation immediately. They interviewed Tracy's family, friends, and co-workers, trying to find anyone with a possible grudge or dark obsession. One of the people questioned was Tracy's ex-boyfriend, with whom she had recently talked about reconciling. Notably, he claimed that the two had agreed to get back together the night before the slaying. Potentially suspiciously, none of Tracy's friends or family could corroborate this account. That said, it's possible that she simply had a busy day and didn't think to tell anyone yet. This attack happened in 1989, and you couldn't just message your group chats and update everyone on what's going on. Notably, the security guard who found her was also considered a suspect, especially since he could have easily gained access to the shop. That said, a major break was about to come from a somewhat unlikely source. 3 months later, in June 1989, a startling lead suddenly emerged. A man calling himself Don phoned a national confession hotline based in Las Vegas and left a chilling recorded message. In a calm, regretful tone, the caller confessed that 3 months ago he had slain a woman in Frederick, Maryland. He went on to say the girl had been working in a ladies' sportswear store and that he often used to visit her there when she was alone. In the recording, Don claimed an argument in the stockroom had escalated, and he pulled out a knife he carried at all times, attacking her. The caller expressed remorse, saying he realized he had created a lot of sadness and even thought about surrendering to police. He confessed that ultimately he decided to remain free because he was worried about the punishment and the potential of facing the chair. Eerily, he added, quote, "You might think that in making this tape I'm setting myself up to be caught, but there are a lot of guys named Don and Frederick." The confession hotline staff promptly alerted law enforcement. The Frederick police listened to the tape and were struck by the level of detail and emotion. They also believed that he provided information that could have only been known by the perpetrator. Also, keep this last part in mind going forward, because it's going to be important. Investigators traced the anonymous call to a payphone inside a Safeway supermarket in Walkersville, a small town about 8 miles from Frederick. This gave police their first real break in the case. Frederick detectives treated the confession as a serious lead. They kept the contents of the call largely under wraps at first, hoping Don might reach out again or that someone who knew him would come forward. After a while, the cops decided that the waiting game sucks and decided to address the mystery caller directly. On October 10th, 1989, the authorities published an open letter to Don in a local paper. Unfortunately, Don did not respond to this public appeal, and weeks went by with no further word from the anonymous confessor. Then, in late October 1989, an unexpected tip came from a self-proclaimed psychic in Massachusetts. A woman named Martha Woodworth contacted Frederick police and said that a young man had been calling her, claiming to seek psychic help to find the perpetrator in Tracy's case. The man gave his name as Sean, which has more than a passing resemblance to the name Don. According to Woodworth, Sean seemed disturbingly obsessed with Tracy's case, and he repeatedly phoned her and even mailed her newspaper clippings about the case. Sensing that Sean might actually be the perpetrator himself, or at least know something, Woodworth alerted the authorities. Investigators noticed that the return address on the envelope of clippings Sean sent was in Walkersville, Maryland. This was the same town where the confession payphone call had originated a few months before. The authorities thought this could hardly be a coincidence. Hoping to confirm their suspicions, Frederick's police chief played the tape of Don's confession over the phone to Woodworth. As soon as she heard the voice, Martha Woodworth said she felt a chill. She immediately recognized the caller's voice as the same person she knew as Sean. It appeared that Don and Sean were one and the same. Armed with this information, detectives finally had a potential name and face for the mystery caller. Police brought this man in for questioning, but he refused to talk. He invoked his rights and wouldn't answer investigators' questions, an act that, combined with all the other circumstances in the case, clearly did absolutely nothing to lower suspicion. The next day, armed with a search warrant, officers combed through his residence. Inside, they found stacks of newspaper articles and writings about Tracy's slaying, indicating he had been intensely following the case. For a moment, it seemed the mystery might finally be solved. However, forensic analysis of the collected evidence didn't find anything definitively linking the young man to the crime scene. For reasons unknown, the man known as Sean and Don was officially ruled out as a suspect by the authorities soon afterwards. Interestingly, they haven't said why this is the case, because the investigation is active and ongoing, but they have confirmed that it can't be him. And keep this in mind, because I'll be coming back to this individual more when we discuss the theories on what happened to Tracy. As the years passed, Tracy Kirkpatrick's case remained unsolved, but it was never forgotten. Several theories about who ended her life have been debated by law enforcement and those close to the case, as well as by amateur online investigators. One enduring theory focuses on the security guard, who was the person to discover Tracy's body. Some have questioned what happened during the hour-and-a-half period between the closing of the clothing store and Tracy being found. There's also some suggestion online that the security guard's father had been a sheriff in Frederick County, which has fueled dark speculation among some that a cover-up occurred. However, there are no reputable sources that have reported this, and this appears to be purely the work of the rumor mill until proven otherwise. The authorities themselves favor the idea that a friend or acquaintance showed up, perhaps to profess interest in her. When she refused him, it's speculated that he attacked her. That said, this theory, despite being an official theory, is also highly speculative, given the circumstances of the case. Over the years, more speculative ideas have also surfaced. Another theory suggests that the individual who went by Sean or Don was in fact somehow involved in Tracy's demise. Under this theory, the authorities may have publicly announced that he was cleared to make this individual think that he had quote-unquote beaten the police. Given this, they may have expected that he would let his guard down and perhaps slip up after his aliases were cleared as being the person responsible. This may have been combined with enhanced surveillance being employed by the cops. That said, I think this sort of 4D chess is unlikely, and it's probably just that this individual just became obsessed with Tracy and tried to insert himself into the investigation. One fringe theory that occasionally comes up online is that Tracy's slaying might be connected to an unidentified individual known as the I-70 perpetrator. Except, no one actually knows him as the I-70 perpetrator, but you know exactly what I mean. This perpetrator is believed to have slain at least 6 store clerks in the Midwest in the early 1990s, targeting women working alone in shops along the Interstate 70 corridor. Since Tracy was also a young woman who was attacked while closing a store, some wonder if her 1989 case was an earlier crime by the same perpetrator. However, there's no evidence linking Tracy's demise to those Midwestern slayings. The timing and location are different, with the I-70 events occurring several years later in a different part of the country. However, even with all the differences, this theory has never been fully ruled out by the authorities, though they've made it clear they don't take it too seriously. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder for you to share this video with 2 of your friends. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and to hit that notification bell as well, and turn on all notifications. On July 7th, 1994, a group of hikers made a grim discovery at a remote campsite area known as Windy Point in Montrose County, Colorado. While exploring an area about 25 miles west of the town of Montrose, they came across a human skull and jawbone lying on the ground. Shocked by the find, the hikers collected the skull and jaw in a container to protect them from scavenging animals, and left a note for authorities before hiking out for help. The next day, a forest ranger and a sheriff's detective returned to the site with the hiking group. As they searched the area, they found more human remains scattered around, including portions of a spine, a shoulder blade, and an upper arm bone. Investigators recovered a piece of a woman's black vinyl belt near the bones, the only item of clothing or personal effect found at the scene. There was, in essence, no trace of any identification beyond the skeleton itself. Given the remote location and the condition of the remains, authorities immediately suspected foul play. A local medical examiner conducted a forensic examination of the remains, which yielded several clues about the victim. The remains were of a white female, estimated to be between 35 and 45 years old, approximately 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall, with reddish-brown hair. Examination of the skull and bones noted 2 distinctive medical conditions. The woman had suffered from TMJ syndrome, a jaw disorder, and showed signs of scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. These health details, though not particularly rare or even uncommon, were hoped to help identify her if matching medical records or descriptions could be found. Investigators also paid close attention to the victim's teeth. Several teeth had been removed by a dentist during her life, and notably, one molar had a gold crown, and another tooth had a full gold restoration. Unfortunately, after checking her dentals against databases of missing persons and known dental records at the time, no match was immediately found. Notably, the condition of the remains made determining an exact cause of death impossible, as there was no obvious trauma that was evident on the bones. However, the fact that the body appeared to have been dumped with no clothing except a belt strongly suggested this hadn't been an accident. Investigators theorized that the woman had been slain somewhere else and her body deliberately disposed of at the Windy Point site. Based on decomposition, authorities suspected she had been left there in late 1993, perhaps in the fall, meaning she might have been dead for several months before the discovery. Montrose County Sheriff's investigators eventually dubbed the unknown victim the Windy Point Jane Doe for the location where she was found. From the start, the biggest challenge was identifying the victim. Investigators pored over missing persons reports from Colorado and neighboring states, looking for a woman whose age, description, and dental work might match the Windy Point Jane Doe. As months turned into years, no one stepped forward to report a person matching the description, an unusual situation that left investigators with little to go on. In 1995, as part of their efforts to generate leads, the authorities sent the unknown woman's skull to a forensic institute in Washington, D.C. During this time, a forensic artist created a rather unique facial reconstruction, which you're probably going to want to look at right now if you don't value your ability to sleep. The resulting clay model was photographed, and a sketch of the approximate face was widely circulated to the public by the sheriff's office. The hope was that someone might recognize the woman's face, though as you can see, the results of this reconstruction were definitely questionable to say the least. That said, the uncanny nature of the reconstruction definitely attracted attention to the case, which otherwise wouldn't have attracted that much media coverage. Unfortunately, despite media attention and distribution of the reconstructed image, no solid leads emerged from it, and the Jane Doe's identity remained a mystery. By the late 2010s, forensic technology had advanced dramatically. Techniques such as DNA profiling and genetic genealogy, which were not options in 1994, started to crack cold cases that had languished for years. In the Windy Point case, the remains had been deemed too decomposed for traditional DNA identification back in the 90s. However, in 2020, Montrose County investigators decided to take a fresh look at extracting DNA from the Jane Doe's remains. This was enabled thanks to new methods that could work with old degraded samples. Evidence from the remains would be submitted to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for advanced analysis in August 2020. The CBI's Cold Case and Forensic Lab Division had begun employing forensic genetic genealogy. This process can identify an unknown person by locating relatives in DNA databases and building out a family tree. The Sheriff's Office and CBI obtained a DNA sample from the Jane Doe's remains and uploaded the genetic profile for comparison, hoping to find any familial connections. For nearly 2 years, specialists worked on the case behind the scenes. They also re-examined the victim's dental information alongside the DNA data, ensuring that if a potential identity was found, it could be confirmed with the distinctive dental records on file. In April 2022, the persistence paid off, and the sheriff of Montrose County received an eagerly awaited call from the CBI. The DNA profile of the Windy Point Jane Doe had matched to family members associated with a missing persons report from 1993. Nearly 28 years after the remains were found, investigators finally learned Jane Doe's real name, Susan Elizabeth Hops. Susan Hops was a 45-year-old woman who had been reported missing from Pierce County, Washington on August 9, 1993. She fit the general profile investigators had established. Her age, physical description, and even details like her dental work aligned with the Jane Doe. With the identification of Susan Hops, the nearly 30-year-old mystery of her identity was solved. This breakthrough also transformed the investigation. It was no longer a hunt for a name, but now a hunt for a perpetrator as well. Montrose County authorities announced that, based on the circumstances, Susan Hops's death would continue to be investigated as a slaying. Notably, officials pointed out that Hops had no known ties to Colorado, reinforcing the theory that she did not end up at Windy Point on her own. Detectives from Montrose County immediately began collaborating with law enforcement in Washington state to retrace Susan's last known activities and contacts. Despite having been identified for quite some time, the tragic circumstances around Susan Hopp's passing still remains unknown. At present, there haven't been any further developments noted in her case, though her case is an active and ongoing investigation. Notably, she was last seen leaving her home in Washington state in the company of two individuals. Little more has been publicly released at this point, and her case hasn't received much significant attention beyond the uncanny nature of her clay facial reconstruction. Marianne Johnson was a 54-year-old account representative at a North Hollywood department store and also a co-owner of a recently shuttered local restaurant in Los Angeles. In January 1994, this ordinary working day took a tragic turn when Marianne left her job and vanished without a trace. She was last seen on the evening of January 19, 1994, as she clocked out of Robinson May, the department store where she worked. She told colleagues of plans to meet her estranged husband, Andrew Johnson, the following day. Marianne never made that meeting. By the next day, she had disappeared, marking the start of a haunting mystery that endures decades later. Marianne lived in the Reseda area of Los Angeles and had been trying to rebuild her personal life. She and her husband Andrew were separated but in the process of reconciliation. On that Wednesday in January, after finishing work, Marianne mentioned to co-workers that she intended to see Andrew soon. However, Andrew later told police that although he had spoken with Marianne on January 19th, they had no plans to meet on January 20th, contradicting what Marianne had said at work. The couple's relationship had been improving. They were seeing each other again despite the prior separation in 1993, so Marianne's friends initially thought little of her comment. It wasn't until Marianne failed to return home or contact anyone that those close to her realized something was very wrong. 1 week after Marianne's disappearance, a critical clue emerged. On January 26, 1994, police discovered Marianne's car, a black 1988 Chevrolet Corvette, abandoned in the parking lot of Louisiana West. This was a restaurant in Van Nuys that Marianne co-owned with her husband. The restaurant had recently gone out of business and was closed at the time. Investigators found the Corvette locked, and, puzzlingly, Marianne's car keys were located inside the locked restaurant itself. This bizarre detail suggested that whoever parked the car at the restaurant had access to the building. The scene raised more questions than answers. There were no obvious signs of struggle reported at the car or inside the restaurant, and it's unclear if any forensic evidence was recovered from the vehicle or the premises. To the investigators, it almost looked as if Marianne had driven to the shuttered eatery and vanished into thin air. Police were hopeful that the Corvette might lead to a break in the case. They appealed to the public for any information about sightings of the car in the days after Marianne went missing. Detectives specifically wanted to hear from anyone who might have seen who parked the Corvette at the Louisiana West lot on that day in January. Yet, despite this hopeful lead, the trail was growing cold and days turned into weeks, with no sign of Marianne herself. As the investigation deepened, a disturbing piece of Marianne's recent past surfaced. Marianne's sister came forward with information about a menacing encounter just a month before the disappearance. In late December 1993, only a few days before Christmas, Marianne had been approached by 3 unknown men. These men delivered a warning that was as bizarre as it was frightening. They claimed someone had paid them $800 to break Marianne's legs, but they said they decided not to harm her and instead wanted to caution her that someone wanted to hurt her. The men didn't reveal who had hired them or why that person bore such malice toward Marianne. Understandably, Marianne was shaken by this incident and told her sister about it. Now, to me, this seems to have more in common with a threat from a loan shark type of individual rather than anything else. But I'll come back to that shortly. However, it appears she didn't know who was behind the threat, and there is no indication she reported it to police at the time. Notably, she doesn't appear to have believed that her husband was behind the threat. This ominous warning hanging over Marianne's head would take on new significance once she vanished. When detectives learned of the threat, it shifted the tone of the entire investigation. By late June 1994, more than 5 months after Marianne's disappearance, the Los Angeles Police Department officially acknowledged that they feared the worst. They issued a statement that they believed that she had met with foul play, likely in a targeted crime. From early on, Marianne's disappearance presented a single troubling question: what really happened on the night of January 19th, 1994? Several theories have been considered over the years, each addressing different pieces of the puzzle. One theory is that Marianne was the victim of a targeted abduction or attack arranged by a person with a grudge. The threatening incident before Christmas 1993 is central to this idea. The fact that someone allegedly paid professionals to harm her indicates that Marianne had an enemy willing to resort to violence. It's possible that whoever was behind that $800 payment escalated their efforts when the initial scare tactic didn't achieve whatever result they wanted. In this scenario, Marianne could have been lured somewhere under false pretenses or ambushed after work. The presence of her car at the closed restaurant might have been a ploy to mislead the investigation or buy time. After all, this was well before the mass adoption of high-quality surveillance equipment with virtually limitless storage. What lends credence to the targeted attack theory is that nothing in Marianne's life suggests she simply left on her own. Another theory centers on Marianne's estranged husband, though he has been cleared by the police as a suspect. In cases of missing persons or foul play, investigators routinely look at those closest to the victim. Andrew was one of the last people known to have spoken to Marianne and was the person she mentioned planning to see. The couple's relationship, while strained in the past, was reportedly improving, but they did have a complicated history with multiple breakups. Some have suggested there could have been undisclosed conflicts or mistrust between them that wasn't disclosed to the investigators. Further, Andrew told police he hadn't actually arranged to meet Marianne the night she disappeared. He cooperated with the investigation, and authorities never named him as a suspect in her disappearance. Another theory, of course, suggests that Marianne may have simply left on her own, and I swear that every missing person case has to have someone throw out the voluntary disappearance theory, but I just don't see any evidence whatsoever for it here. My own theory is that Marianne Johnson's disappearance might be linked to the mounting debts and financial turmoil surrounding the failed restaurant she co-owned. It's possible that the people who came to break her legs were actually debt collectors hired by an underworld figure. After all, it's unlikely that many average people without underworld connections could successfully hire a small crew to go out and intimidate someone the way they did with Marianne. It's possible that these quote-unquote creditors resorted to intimidation or even violence as a means to secure what was owed. The discovery of Marianne's Corvette parked at the shuttered restaurant is particularly suspicious. This detail suggests that whoever was responsible for moving her car had knowledge of the restaurant. Even more disturbingly, it's always possible that her husband was the one who was in debt to these individuals. Ragnar Lothbrok has captivated the popular imagination as one of the most famous Vikings to have ever lived, or possibly never lived at all. His story looms large in medieval sagas, modern television adaptations, and countless retellings over a millennium. Yet historians still wrestle with a fundamental question. Was Ragnar a real flesh-and-blood individual, or was he a legend woven from the achievements of several Vikings? From the moment he entered into medieval literature, Ragnar was depicted as a warrior king of extraordinary prowess, forging a reputation that often defies simple classification. He's portrayed as the son of a Swedish king named Sigurd Ring, and as the father of several notable Vikings, including Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. These sons would, according to the sagas, go on to carve out kingdoms, launch invasions into Anglo-Saxon England, and become household names in their own right. Most of the details of Ragnar's life come from medieval sources, such as the Old Norse tale of Ragnar's sons and Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum. These tales include significant elements of myth and fantasy that can't be verified through contemporary records. One of the most famous narratives associated with Ragnar is his capture and death at the hands of the King of Northumbria in the mid-9th century. Medieval chronicles and later retellings claim that Ragnar led raids into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, where he was ultimately defeated, captured, and thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. Whether this gruesome execution actually happened is still disputed, but the story has become one of the best-known Viking legends. Some versions describe Ragnar, even while being bitten by serpents, defiantly reciting heroic poetry and prophesying vengeance from his sons. In addition to his Northumbrian exploits, Ragnar is also credited with launching a daring attack on Paris in 845. According to some accounts, he sailed up the River Seine with a Viking fleet and terrified the city into paying a large ransom. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, allegedly paid off the raiders to prevent further devastation. In verified historical records, a Viking leader named Reginharus, a Latinized form of Ragnar, is indeed mentioned as attacking Paris around this time. This lends some circumstantial evidence to the idea that Ragnar might have been more than just a legendary figure. However, the name Reginharus doesn't conclusively prove that he was the Ragnar of later saga fame. Scholars argue that several Viking leaders could have been confused or combined into a single legendary persona over the centuries, thereby creating the composite figure of Lothbrok. Despite the many variations and embellishments in the stories, common threads tend to appear. He's usually described as cunning, courageous, and brutal when necessary. Yet the medieval texts that mention him were written centuries after the events they describe. Grammaticus, for instance, composed the Gesta Danorum in the late 12th century, about 300 years or more after Ragnar's supposed lifetime. The Icelandic sagas that feature Ragnar were likely set down in writing around the 13th century, though experts agree they're almost certainly based upon well-established earlier traditions. This considerable time gap means that the stories had plenty of opportunity to evolve in oral tradition before ever being written, thus giving time for fact to blend with fiction. To understand why questions about Ragnar's historicity are so difficult to resolve, it helps to consider the broader context of Viking Age sources. The Vikings themselves often left behind no written histories or chronicles that modern scholars can rely on, in the same way they might consult Frankish or Anglo-Saxon texts. Instead, most of what we know about Viking expeditions, personalities, and achievements comes from chronicles written by their enemies, such as Anglo-Saxon or Frankish monks. Norse people themselves created little in the way of written records, with runestones being the only meaningful surviving records. These runestones, however, provide just brief tidbits of information, and many were raised with the explicit intent of bragging and self-promotion. These runestones often compared real people's actions to those of legendary figures, with it being seen as virtuous to claim to have accomplished something as great as a mythic heroic figure. Notably, the famous runestones found in Scandinavia often commemorate powerful individuals, but none explicitly mention Ragnar Lothbrok, or anyone who could match up with him. That said, this doesn't mean such runestones don't exist, or didn't exist at one point. Historians estimate that 90% of runestones that survived have been discovered. However, that still leaves numerous runestones which didn't survive and some which are still hidden away. Notably, many of the runestones which have survived come from the period where Scandinavia was being Christianized. Some have speculated that a runestone mentioning the exploits of an explicitly heathen king like Ragnar may have been destroyed by zealous converts centuries later. Given the nature of these varied sources, these accounts can be contradictory, romanticized, and of course, openly biased. Even the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the more reliable sources for Viking activity in England, offers only brief mentions of particular raids or individuals. Beyond the written sources, archaeologists have tried to find evidence that might verify or refute the existence of a single person behind the legends. While excavations of Viking sites in Scandinavia and the British Isles have yielded incredible artifacts, none have directly confirmed the presence of a real Ragnar Lothbrok. It's important to note that the sagas themselves sometimes portray events that span different time frames and attribute them to a single hero figure. The Great Heathen Army's invasion of England in 865 is traditionally said to have been led by the sons of Ragnar, seeking vengeance for their father's death. Historically, we know that an army of considerable size did indeed arrive in England around that time, leading to the downfall of multiple Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But it's not entirely certain whether this event was truly triggered by the sons of a singular Ragnar, or if the story was later romanticized to fit the heroic narrative of the sagas. Despite these historiographical challenges, the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok remains highly influential for a few key reasons. He embodies many of the traits that modern audiences associate with Vikings: bravery, seafaring expertise, fierce loyalty to kin, and a thirst for both adventure and wealth. While it's easy to focus on the violent aspects of Viking life, the sagas also highlight Ragnar's strategic ability and determination. The drama associated with his supposed death, being thrown into a pit of snakes, and his sons avenging him, ensure that the story remains memorable and captivating. Ragnar also serves as a convenient focal point in narratives that otherwise would be diffuse. His existence ties together various Viking campaigns in England, Ireland, and the Frankish territories under one mythic banner. So, is Ragnar Lothbrok the fearless Viking who sacked Paris, ravaged Northumbria, and fathered some of the most legendary Viking leaders of all time? Or is he a symbolic figure, a patchwork of legendary deeds attributed to multiple warlords, all woven into one grand saga? Realistically, we can't say with absolute certainty, though scholars generally believe the latter rather than the former. What we can say for sure is that someone carried out many of those raids, and these exploits significantly impacted the political landscape of medieval Europe. Taijin Kyofusho is often described as a culture-bound syndrome from Japan, and it involves a profound fear of embarrassing or offending others through one's behavior or appearance. It's frequently associated with excessive self-consciousness about bodily functions or perceived personal flaws. Historically, Taijin Kyofusho attracted attention in the mid-20th century when Japanese psychiatrists began to classify unique conditions reflective of cultural norms. The term Taijin Kyofusho loosely translates to the disorder of fear of interpersonal relations. It suggested that the conceptual framework for this condition partially derives from collectivist values in Japanese society, where harmony and social cohesion are highly valued. Any perceived breach of etiquette can cause profound distress for those with the disorder, which may explain why this anxiety is so socially oriented. In the 1970s and 1980s, the condition started to gain international recognition when clinicians from different countries compared culture-bound syndromes worldwide. Researchers noted that while social anxiety disorders could appear anywhere, there was something different about the presentation of this one. What differentiated Taijin Kyofusho was the extreme emphasis on the sufferer's concern about being a source of discomfort to others. This led to deeper discussions on how cultural values shape the expression and classification of mental health conditions. Eventually, Taijin Kyofusho was included in discussions of culture-bound syndromes in the DSM-4. Treatment approaches can include cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, and pharmacological interventions.